because we have another panel. There you go, right there. So there's the question. How can we revitalise UK industry to drive fair growth? For this discussion, I'm delighted to welcome to the stage, and you can be generous in your applause as they mount the stage, Claire Ainsley, Director of the Centre-Left Renewal Project at the Progressive Policy Institute. I think that's in DC. Ben Franklin, Director of Research and Policy, CPP. Jürgen Meyer, Chair of Digital Catapult and co-founder of VOC-L, a network of responsible business voices. Giles Wilkes, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government. And on my immediate right, Mehreen Khan, my Times Radio colleague, also economics editor at the Times, who will chair the session. Mehreen, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Henry. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's brilliant to take part today in what should be a very interesting session. And I was speaking to some of the guys in the green room that when I took this job about a year and a half ago, I didn't think I'd be spending so much time thinking about industrial policy. But life comes at you very fast when you're covering the UK economy. And so I think we will be able to have pretty wide-ranging discussion. We've got 50 minutes today. The panelists are going to do some opening remarks, then we're going to have a discussion. I'm afraid we're only going to take questions from the room, so not for participants online. But if you do have a burning question, just get your hand up as soon as I'm sort of scouring the room. There'll be mics. Pertinent questions, pointed questions, no statements or grandstanding would be brilliant. So I think we're going to cover this topic in as much depth as possible, given the variety of the panelists that we have, and Henry introduced them. So I'm going to kick off with Claire, who is not Washington-based, but is living in the UK, but working for an institute which is based out in the US, who've been doing lots of important work, thinking about how Biden is approaching the topic of industrial policy, fair growth, sustainability, and the green supply chains. So Claire, maybe you could kick us off with some of your thoughts about the policy debates in the UK, but also how it's being seen from across the Atlantic.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for the CPP for inviting us to be part of the panel. I thought I'd kick off by talking about UK policy, in particular around Labour, as until I started the new role with the Progressive Policy Institute, based in the US at the start of this year, I was Director of Policy for Labour and for Keir Starmer since he was elected leader in April 2020. So have some background that I thought it might be helpful to share with you in terms of Labour's thinking around the formation of its first mission, because you'll, I hope, be aware that Labour has charted this missions approach to government, and these are absolutely not pledges to go on a pledge card. They are about goals for the country, and not just goals for government, but they are missions that we can all get behind. And I think part of the message is about what an industrial strategy should do, should be about mobilising business, industry, workers, citizens, as well as, of course, all the different layers of government that it's speaking to. Labour's first mission, and the mission that has kind of taken precedence over others, has been this mission on growth, so securing the highest growth in the G7. But Labour are really clear in the way that they've put that together, and they specifically said, with good jobs and productivity growth in every part of the country, making everyone, not just a few, better off. And I think there's a radicalism there which has been somewhat underplayed, because people have, as naturally you do, focus on the kind of the top line about highest growth in the G7. This point about growth coming from every part of the country is, I think, a complete step change in the way that we thought about economic growth. Excuse me. So Labour wouldn't term it fair growth or sustainable growth or inclusive growth, but they would talk about growth from every part of the country. And that is not, as we have charted, that is not the current model of growth that we have. And we're not going to get it without a serious industrial strategy behind it to get there. But I think we have to first acknowledge that it is a huge step change to have that as the stated goal of economic policy. It is their explicit answer around living standards and how we're going to improve living standards. And I think it is clearly redistribution will play a role, and we've talked about some of the kind of politics and economics of that this morning. but it is a move away from the idea that we can have a model of growth that is then, we grow the economy, and as has been said this morning, and that is what then is able to produce us what goes into public services and so on and so forth. And to obviously, to one extent, that is true, but what Labour are trying to capture is this idea that we will have growth being generated out of every part of the country with a much wider array of industries and contributors to that, be it the industries of hospitality and culture. Why shouldn't those be seen as part of our industrial strategy? Just as much as politicians love to talk about manufacturing as important as it is, we have a huge amount of industries that would form part of that industrial strategy out of our regions. And that's how Labour see us growing the economy. But we're going to have to take some fairly big actions to get there. And we should talk about some of what those are. I would say that we should give some credit for the Centre for Progressive Policy, who for some years now have produced a steady flow of the kinds of arguments and policy ideas that Labour is now taking up and using. And yes, a lot of those aren't necessarily up in lights because, let's face it, they're interesting to us. They're not necessarily the things that make the weather when you're the opposition, but they are much of the depth of thinking that's sitting behind a lot of this is work that the CPP has been leading on, and all of you, as part of their wide network, have contributed to. So absolutely, this is a very deliberate step change, and it is going in this kind of direction. The question is, how do you get there? And Labour have actually put out a raft of initiatives already. So they have already produced an industrial strategy. They have already had a commission, a very wide-ranging commission on the future of the UK, by former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, which was really about, well, what are the powers that you might need to drive greater economic growth? And the most interesting part of that commission, I think, was not necessarily some of the constitutional changes, which typically grab the headlines. It was really this notion that throughout the UK, there's 233 economic clusters that do not map onto the political geography of the country, but they do map onto where we could drive growth from. And obviously, this is an argument that Lord Sainsbury, amongst others, has made. So Labour's really interested in how do you unlock that economic potential. They have their Green Prosperity Plan, and we'll hear from Ed Miliband later. But the idea behind that the clean energy transition offers us the opportunity to invest in industry in a way that we haven't done on a really strategic level as part of a grand national plan ever, potentially. Skills and the workforce is obviously a core part of it, and Labour did their commission led by Lord O'Neill on startups. So just briefly touch on US policy because we want to get into everybody else's contributions. Labour are clearly taking inspiration from Biden. I mean, they literally put references to Biden on Labour press releases, so there is no kind of subtle art here of policy transfer. It is very explicitly nodding to Biden, who has produced this, huge stimulus to the US economy. It's the Inflation Reduction Act is obviously the big one that we know, but there is a slew of legislation and initiatives that have come out from the US administration. We're starting to see some of the, you might say, the fruit of some of that. So US's growth figures, particularly last quarter, look good. Wages starting to go up, inflation starting to come down. But the problem from a centre-left point of view is that it is not landing with voters. And those of you who are watching US politics closely know that the presidential elections will be in a year away. Only 30% of Americans think that the economy is in good shape at the moment. PPI just did a poll of working class voters in the US, and when they were asked which president from the last 30 years has done the most for working families, Biden got 12%, but the winner of all presidents was Trump with 44%. So 44% of working class Americans say that it is Trump that has done the most for them, beating Clinton, Obama, Bush. So it might be that these big infrastructure spends take time to filter through. There's been lots of learning along the way, particularly on planning, which I think Labour have learnt from us, and they've announced their changes on planning. But we have to be honest about the fact that these big investments, I presume probably a majority of us in this room think are, whether you think the level of is right or delivery is right, is broadly the right thing to do to stimulate the kind of industry we need in this country. They are not finding favour with the American public, and that is not translating, and that is a huge problem. There basically is not a substitute. You can't use industrial strategy as a political substitute or an economic substitute for the tangible improvements people need to see in their wages, bringing their costs down, that kind of bread and butter politics and policy. So I'll leave it there on that sort of slightly gloomy note, but perhaps we can get into the politics as well as the economics.
We will definitely come back to that issue. Jürgen, you used to run Siemens in the UK. You're now part of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. You've heard Claire surmising Labour's pitch for the next general election, but how do you see where the UK is right now, and also what are some of your thoughts about what it could be under a potential future government that's not a Tory government?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, and a real pleasure to be here. So, I mean, first of all, sort of taking a view as to where we are right now, and that is, you know, I'm relieved that actually we're beginning to have a conversation again that engages business and engages particularly industrial policy and manufacturing. It's been a pretty dire 6 years in terms of that dialogue with this particular government, having ebbed and flowed on industrial policy before then. And actually, the reason why the conversation has returned to a more sensible ground is partially because of what Claire was just talking about, which is that, you know, we're finally realizing that things like the Inflation Reduction Act, but also European Union's response to that and everything that's happening in countries like Germany, France, etc., you know, we have to have a response to that. And investment, particularly inward investment, is leaking away from the UK in key industrial areas. So that's one reason. But the other reason, which I think is actually the bigger reason, is that the government suddenly saw that the Labour Party was beginning to have a rather positive engagement with business. And indeed, that conversation was a lot around industrial policy and industrial strategy. So it was a bit of a sort of an action from government to say, my goodness, you know, if we're not careful, business is going to be talking more to the Labour Party than they are to us. And indeed, I can confirm that has very much become the situation. Of course, people are still hedging their bets, but, you know, there is more conversation, I would say, going on with the Labour Party. So that's where we are now. Look, what do we need to do going forward? Which I think was your next question. Is well, there's just one word, and that is consistency. I mean, what business, what inward investment is crying out for? People like my previous company, by the way, Siemens is a huge inward investor, has always been, will continue to invest in the UK, but, you know, is in this current climate going to invest a little bit more in countries like the USA and Germany than the UK. And the key reason for that has been confusion and consistency. You know, I think we've had 11 growth plans in this country during this government period, and we've had considerable ebbs and flows in terms of approach, particularly to industrial policy. And I know, because as Giles knows, who will speak later, that I have sat on pretty much every industrial strategy council in this country since actually the last one of Peter Mandelson. Some of you might remember New Industry, New Jobs. I remember sitting on that, and then went on various industrial councils as we went. So consistency is really important. And then it's also focus. And we do need to focus down on key industries, key technologies, and some of these, and by the way, I'm glad we're sort of getting away from this really quite strange conversation about picking winners. I'm never in favour of picking winners of individual companies, which, by the way, is what a lack of industrial strategy ends up forcing you to do. So actually, this government that says it doesn't like picking winners is now giving lots of money to Nissan, Jaguar, Land Rover, Mini to bring their electric vehicle production to the UK. What would be much better is to pick the whole industry of the electric vehicle transformation and create the ecosystem, the innovation support that encourages all and more companies to come on board with that. And we need to do more of that. The other key technology is the hydrogen economy, which is blindingly obvious in terms of there being much more local value that we can create. And the UK is particularly well placed at that. I believe those sectors do need to be frontier sectors, so I'll disagree with you slightly, Claire. I'm less a fan of having industrial strategies, for example, for a retail sector. I tend to find that retail will follow the money once you've created the high-wage jobs. I much prefer, particularly for northern regions, to find ways through this strategy to create industrial and high-wage jobs. An example for that is what we did in the Humber. Siemens were a big part of that in terms of creating a whole new offshore wind revolution. And I can tell you that retail has done pretty well out of that, but what actually created it was the high wages and the demand that that was able to put onto the retail and entertainment sector. I do, by the way, think that creative and arts is a frontier sector, and there's a lot of innovation that can go into that sector. And then my final point is about regional and devolution. I'd like to see more from the Labour Party in that space. Actually, one of the things that has been coming out of the more recent activities or policies out of this government has been quite helpful. It needs spreading further, but we do now have Manchester as an increasingly devolved city. We're beginning to see that in South Yorkshire, new devolution deals being announced in West Yorkshire, and hopefully also in Lancashire, and obviously we have one in the northeast. So I think that devolution and then finding ways through that devolved industrial policy to find ways that locally you can retain some of the probably the business rates that you can create through greater industrial business, and then be able to locally reinvest that in your industrial strategy, then constantly doing this sort of bidding process that you were just talking about, that you did for your fantastic Eurovision in Liverpool. And by the way, I loved what you said about you're now thinking about creating your own, and that's what devolution is all about ultimately. By the way, Merseyside has a devolution deal as well. Sorry to miss that. And it's very important that these regions gain confidence and can invest in their own. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jürgen. Giles, you have advised politicians, including Theresa May, who I remember standing on the steps of Downing Street after she was elected, sort of promising actually a lot of things that we've just heard about, making sure that growth in the UK is fair, that it touches every part of the country. And then we've also heard from Jürgen sort of how many of the sort of stillborn industrial strategies that the various governments have had for the last 25 years. Maybe you could walk us through why and what needs to change for this to change and to get the fair growth and the revitalisation of UK industry that is sustainable and successful.
Thank you very much, Mehreen. Yes, she did stand on the... I read the speeches. In fact, I even read the July 2013 Theresa May speech, where it was absolutely clear she was going to try and become the next leader, where she said, I believe that you should have a strategic state. And even though I wasn't a member of the Conservative Party, I had a feeling that a call might come in to say, we've said all these things and we don't really know how to do them. So what can we do about this? And so I did go in and try to work on broken markets, industrial strategy and all this sort of stuff, and I hope maybe over a coffee I can talk to some of you about how that went. But it's so why didn't it work? Look, one of the reasons, building a little bit on what Claire has said here, if you were to draw a McKinsey 2x2 with the goodness of the policy on the horizontal and whether it's popular on the vertical, some of the Conservative policies have simply gone to the evil quadrant. where it's sort of bad but popular. I mean, I think the ultimate example, this is not wishing to cause controversy here, might be Brexit, where you can say lots of really popular, muscular-sounding things, but they're really quite bad for the most important thing in economics, which is market access. But also, you know, tax breaks that don't pay for themselves and are simply popular, but then just drain the state of its ability to fund things going forward. Those would be my most favourite ones, but also changing policy all the time. There's no political credit ever to be had in doing what Jürgen has said there, which is keeping the thing that you inherited and going forward with it. There's always a lot in announcing a new thing or saying that you're getting rid of this piece of waste that you don't really understand. We almost lost the catapult centres, for example, through a foolish Treasury audit around 2017 when they were barely off the ground. We did lose the Manufacturing Advisory Service when Sajid Javid had about 18 months as business secretary. We've recreated it through Made Smarter, which is something that Jürgen has basically created himself and was too modest to mention earlier. But, and it was almost again destroyed, I found out in the green room. This government has an absolute mania for trying to announce new things. They think it sounds decisive to come in and scrap and change. And simply, I mean, we've had something like 6 or 7 governments in the last few years. If we just had one for 10 years, that would be the number one goal, as far as I can see. So when trying to imagine what advice I could give to such a really difficult question as this, just to group it into 3 broad areas, and there's going to be a lot of furious agreement, I suspect, on this panel, like what things do we need to continue, what things do we need to improve, and what things do we need to avoid doing? Under continuing, I'd say things like, not everything this government has done is bad or evil or wrong. There's just the things they do that are actually going quite well, like they have a more rational immigration scheme right now. They might have a more rational state aid scheme. They don't really talk about them, sometimes because it's really awkward with their right. But Made Smarter is a classic example. Made Smarter is a really good example of the sort of institution you build if you care about the long-term capabilities of your industry, and you don't care that you didn't invent it yourself. Like the full expensing announcement that we saw in the autumn statement. This is something that has been called for across the political divide. In fact, the person who really killed capital allowances in the 80s was Nigel Lawson, who you can find in his glorious book, The View from Number 11, that he saw no point in them. That was just one of the zigs and zags in the capital allowance system that we've had for the last, in fact, 100 years. You can find an HMRC webpage with the 100-year history of how we've tried to move in and out of capital allowances. The various institutions that we created under my first stint as special advisor, which was under Vince Cable from 2010 to 2014, like the Aerospace Technology Institute, like the Automotive Propulsion Centre, or things that even, heaven forbid, Kwasi Kwarteng oversaw, like the Life Sciences Vision. All of these things that were created are the sorts of things that industry loves and industry wants to keep on to. And sometimes the past 17 business ministers haven't noticed and destroyed. Please, if you're advising Labour, don't get rid of things just because you didn't invent them, because some of them, the industry just wants you to carry on and there's no politics in them. Then in terms of improving them, local government, I mean, anticipating the sort of question we're asked, how do you get continuity in industrial strategy? Local ownership is one answer, because whereas at the centre, the agenda switches all the time, and it's actually very sort of butterfly attention span, what's trending today. Locally, what matters to your local area is a matter of real continuity. If in the northeast of England they care about carbon capture and storage because they have the pipe network there already and the skills, that's not going to change if the mayor gets overthrown. Likewise, the health and ageing expertise in Manchester, or the ageing centre that's up there in Newcastle, or the entertainment business that's in Liverpool. These are really enduring characteristics, and if you can find a way to give that ownership to local areas, you're going to achieve your continuity too. Obviously, there's difficult trade-offs with national priorities and local priorities and so on. The RDAs, which were a decent attempt to deal with this, also led to a multiplicity of nanotech centres and so forth. It's not going to be easy. You need people who can get on with each other, the centre versus the local area, but that will solve things. We need to have better market access. Market access is the kind of superpower of economics. Why is the US so much more prosperous than us? Mostly because it's a much, much larger internal market. Their ideas will spread over a much bigger cost base. So we've got to do something about this appalling Brexit deal. And I'm sure somebody will, they just probably won't call it that. Alignment with UK needs as well. I really like the mission-based thinking that the Labour government is likely to pursue. The point of it for me is that challenge-based systems, I mean, we introduced an idea called grand challenges under the Greg Clark industrial strategy. These are things that you need to be getting on with, like reorienting your economy for its ageing for the fact that we're all going to be getting a lot older. The net zero, the future of mobility, all of these are things that we know we've got to stick to. So align your industrial needs around them, because that's got credibility to that kind of commitment. And we need to get better at delivery. We do not have a civil service that is used to people actually delivering things, working with business. They shift around their jobs too often. The sorts of things we saw the Vaccine Task Force or the Olympic Delivery Authority do are extremely rare, and that's why we keep remembering them. And finally, there's a void. I would say I agree with Jürgen on the subject of not making every single sector your favourite. Some sectors, and I don't know whether this can be whispered or shouted in a Labour conference, but some sectors capitalism does absolutely fine with. The retail sector, we see an awful lot of ugly churn and new ideas and closure and opening and so forth, and it is difficult, and that's what the state is there for with the welfare system and the regulatory system to make sure that decency is followed. But capitalism works really well to introduce new systems, and the consumer's voice is heard, and the sunk capital costs are not so high that you need long-term state involvement. And the final thing is, don't do too much new institutional invention. I mean, we might need one or two big overarching things to give continuity to industrial strategy, but please don't invent loads and loads more things, because you're just creating work for consultants, and I say that as one, so yeah. That's me.
Charles. Ben, your work is on fair growth, and I'm going to ask a very basic question, but what does fair growth look like in a UK context, and what are the sort of metrics that people like me, whose job is it to sort of cover the economy and sort of translate it to people in an accessible way? What metrics should I be looking at if we think about how the UK can become a country with fairer growth?
Well, thanks very much, and it's great to be speaking on such a prestigious panel. The problem we're talking about industrial strategy and fair growth in this context is that all the good things have already been said. However, I think where I would stress particular importance here is on the role of places, and I think that's where the CPP has had a particular unique selling point since its inception in 2018, 2019, and Claire kindly touched on that earlier, and that's that all of these things are not delivered by national government. A lot of the things we're talking about today should be at least delivered by regional government and supported by local government as well. Traditionally, industrial strategy has been thought of as the Times leader article this week dreadfully set out.
I didn't write that.
Okay, good. Picking winners. It was going back to the kind of 1970s ideas and arguments again, and there's no evidence for it. Well, you know what? We do have some quite good evidence that especially place-based industrial strategy and policy can work. And it can work not just to improve the GVA of a local authority and productivity, but also there's some interesting findings around social mobility in the US manufacturing sector in the States. So increasingly seeing fair growth and industrial strategy through a place lens is incredibly important. And our inclusive growth network, which is mentioned earlier, and thanks for the great presentation about Liverpool and culture, is kind of at the foundation of that, working with places and regions, not just on industrial strategy, but on all the other elements that make up fair growth. And that's also sectors that have great social value, but might not be high GVA, such as social care, for example. Ensuring that we have good jobs in the caring economy is also really important. And I know Labour has identified that as a key issue. Whether that's about productivity or the good work agenda, we can maybe have a bit of a debate about that as well. But certainly, in all the places across the UK, including in some low productivity places, our research has shown that there are industries and nascent industries that have high GVA. The Gordon Brown Review obviously picked some of that up as well. But these are industries that can be nurtured and supported with better infrastructure, whether that's hard physical infrastructure, transportation links, whether it's social infrastructure, childcare support for workers, whether it's other forms of education and training that can help to support and grow those industries. And our work specifically focused on towns and small cities, for example, whereas other work is focused on cities that are lagging, so larger cities that are lagging. So there is, I think, great potential for better investment if we understand the place-based barriers to growth, and that is inherently what our work at CPP has been about. If we look at what's happened since 2019 and earlier focused on this a little bit, is that finally we are sort of thinking about places and left behind places in a different way because of the political necessity to do so. So, if there is some form of long-term agenda that is cross-party, it may well be to focus on the drivers of growth in those very places that we haven't been able to before, because there's such a political necessity to, whether that's Tory, Labour, or some kind of alternative configuration. Obviously, the approaches since 2019 have been very Jekyll and Hyde in terms of, advanced manufacturing plan came out this week. That was really good. Why was that not something that happened 2-3 years ago, the 4.5 billion, and why was it so quietly announced when actually there's a lot of good things in that maybe Labour want to think about taking forward and ramping up? Obviously, Labour's vision is a lot around the Green Prosperity Plan and the £28 billion. Will it, won't it? But crucially, again, that's rooted in place. Parts of where hopefully those new green jobs will be former industrial areas and places that haven't necessarily benefited in the ways that London and the South East have over the last 20 or 30 years. Claire, I know, obviously mentioned Biden's playbook and the bottom-up, middle-out quote that Labour like to roll out a lot. I think there's a lot to be said for that, and that again is focused on place. So place now is at the heart of a renewed focus on industrial strategy. I think what's missing from Labour's approach for fair growth in this sense is, as has been alluded to already, is about where next does the devolution agenda go? So industrial strategy is delivered through places. How do we harness and support the capacity of places, which, let's be honest, through local government has been completely gutted out. So they don't really have much economic planning capacity and understanding of business services. So there's going to have to be and we're going to get later this afternoon as well, we're going to talk about, is it about more resource or reform? But actually there's going to have to be a lot of both, particularly for regional and local government, in order to deliver on this agenda.
Brilliant, thank you. Claire, I might ask you to come back on the places issue and Labour's approach to devolution. And I also want to zoom out again and think about the global context. And how useful is it for Labour to constantly refer back to Biden when the political and fiscal realities of the UK mean that even if you take Bidenomics as your lodestar, Britain is always going to fall short because we just can't do what Biden is doing in terms of the fiscal firepower, but also the mechanism, the tax credits, the local content directives, the recreating of supply chains, the huge geopolitical element with China. The UK is always going to fall short in a context where Biden is the comparator. So should we actually just be speaking and looking less to the US or maybe to the EU, which is doing things around state aid, and think about a kind of a native way of doing green industrial policy? And does that also get to some of the things that Ben is talking about making it very, very local and regional?
I think that's fair, and I think the economies are just so different, and even if we wanted to, we couldn't do a whole bunch of things that the US is doing for the reasons that we've already kind of outlined. So, I understand the power and the star power of being able to say this is what the US is doing, but the reality is that they've lent more firmly into, I think, a kind of Buy America. It's not quite the Trumpian sort of trade barriers approach, but there's no way we could do that even if we thought, even if it was desirable, and I don't think it is desirable. And actually, even in the US, when they're leaning into some of that policy, actually that's not what a lot of voters want particularly. So I'm quite cautious, but I get the idea of doing some international comparators and doing that nod to Biden actually does feel like we could do things differently. And I think that is partly what we've got to get over ourselves in a way is, as Giles says, actually there's been quite a lot of these initiatives have already been tried, but for lots of good and poor reasons, they haven't been fully kind of seen through. I do think we have to lift our gaze a bit and say it does not need to be this way. We could have a motoring economy. We could have a country where people do feel like, whether it is that they're going to go into the arts, they're going to go into manufacturing, or they're going to go into whatever industry, that they feel excited and positive about their future, and that's not where we are now. So I do think it is helpful rhetorically to give us that kind of lift. I think practically, I'm sure the Labour team are listening to some of the downsides. I thought it was really interesting that they've gone so hard on planning reform, which people might have noticed earlier this year, because that is one of the major areas the Biden administration have found problematic. Is you pump that amount of stimulus in, and you have the kinds of permitting systems you have in the US, which have really kind of gummed up their infrastructure projects, and you are not going to be able to realise economically the benefits that we would like to see. So I thought it was interesting that Labour said, hang on a minute, we are going to borrow to invest, but we're going to do this phased over time, and we're going to unblock the blockages first. And I think that's where place comes in, because I think actually they have been quite bold in setting out a new devolution agenda. I understand why they're not going to spell out every inch of that before an election, because that is something that needs to be done with the democratic consent of people and worked through with those places and with the armoury of the civil service. But I think the idea behind it is that every place can have a future it determines. Not every place needs to be needs to be a city of culture or needs to be a new kind of high-tech centre. But every place needs to know what its identity and its future is, and be crucially determined with the people in that place. So I think that potentially is quite exciting. I think that doesn't mean necessarily, as Giles says, lots of new institutional architecture. I think it does mean that you start to have that conversation being driven from places, I hope, when there is a future Labour government.
Yeah, I think, so first of all, it's absolutely right. You know, we can't compete on scale with the USA, and we can't compete with the European Union. But there is an answer, and the answer is collaboration. And I do sort of feel that our leaving the European Union has turned our whole language into the wrong place. If you listen to some of the latest announcements that are made about UK's manufacturing and industrial strategy, it's always, we're best in the world, we're amazing, you know, we're the best, and we're going to, and it's, and you listen to it and you say, are we really? You know, I mean, look, don't get me wrong. I think some of the innovation, the research we have in this country is absolutely amazing. But the better way to do it, take the hydrogen economy again, is to say, well, look, you know, we obviously have a huge advantage in terms of creating the green hydrogen because we have fantastic offshore wind capability. So let that become our specialism, and we create the whole electrolyzer business, and we put pipelines in where we can sell that to other countries like Germany. By the way, that conversation is already happening. You know, so you work out which part of the ecosystem can I take my bit of, and we're not always going to be best at it. And then you can break that same thing down to regional level. Where do I find my bit within that collaboration? And another example I sometimes give is just take it down another level. Take the country where I originate from, Austria. And believe it or not, Austria has a pretty amazing industrial economy. There is actually one in which it's world beating, and it chose to invest in that. Guess what it is? It's ski lift equipment. Now, look, that happens to be something Austria is extremely... It's a huge export industry, by the way. It's absolutely huge industry. Everything else, they just ride on the back of the European Union. They're great in the rail industry supply chain. They have steel manufacturing in Linz in the north of Austria. There is a fantastic automotive supply chain, and it all just supplies the European Union and is part of a European Union ecosystem. So, you know, you can collaborate and make it work without always needing to be the best.
Just on the notion of collaboration, I think this time last year, so much of the panic around the IRA was that it is a protectionist policy, and it will lead to the deindustrialization of countries. We will pay for US policies. Yeah. Having, you know, been working at an arm of a multinational manufacturing giant, is deindustrialization a possibility in Europe and the UK because of what Biden is doing?
Of course. So, you know, the risk is there. But look, you know, Europe as a whole has been deindustrializing for the last 50 years. It's just some countries have been more strategic about holding on to the bits they want to hold on to, and, very importantly, being part of the new. You know, certainly when I was part of all of the UK's industrial strategy councils, there's two approaches. One is protect what you've got, decide what you want to protect. An example of that is, of course, the automotive industry, where you need to protect and make sure you manage the revolution from internal combustion engine to EV. But then even more important, which new industries are you going to take a bigger slice of? And look, you can choose. You can say, I'm not going to have a strategy at all, let free markets design, in which case you're going to deindustrialize at a faster pace. Or you have a strategy, invest, collaborate, and you've got a chance of at least getting some decent industries and jobs out of it. And it's a sort of the ladder space in which you tend to find countries like France, Germany, and even my little Austria example in, and we have just dithered, delayed, and, not really had consistency, as Giles perfectly put.
Sure. Giles, so I've been obviously religiously reading the OBR's latest outlook for the economy, which was out last week. And one of the things that was noticeable is that the Chancellor did stand up and talk about how the UK was going to respond to the IRA and its industrial policy, and he put out a figure of 19 billion, mentioned things like investment zones. But according to the OBR, this has absolutely no meaningful impact on any of its growth projections over the next 5 years. So one question. Investment zones, is that a place policy? So we have now more than a dozen. So these things that used to be called free ports are now called investment zones. Is this something Labour should stick to? Is it just moving economic activity around the country, or can it actually generate new economic activity? And maybe, and the other part, just on the OBR, how much of a meaningful, how big does the government have to get involved in thinking big on industrial policy for it to actually change the productivity and growth trajectory of the economy that actually helps the public finances and the tax base and all the things that, autumn statements and OBR reports care about?
Okay, I will answer the second one first. And it's obviously really, really difficult because there's a lot there already. There's about 5 trillion in capital, 32 million people with vast amounts of skills, a 2.1 trillion pound economy. You don't turn that around really, really quickly. Then again, you can damage it really quickly, as this government has shown. So, actually getting a few things right and the concept of animal spirits and just getting a bit of luck, I could see those OBR forecasts being improved at some point. But no single industry can be picked up, invested in, and can turn around something as large as 2.1 trillion. It will take a long time, but sometimes luck does go your way. And the point is, while there are lots of headwinds that suggest that long-term advanced economy growth is going to be weaker, we reaped the low-hanging fruit of China's entry into the world economy and the best parts of the technological revolution, in my view. Everyone should read Robert Gordon. We've got the ageing coming along. We've got the costs of more expensive energy for the short while to go. We're a long way off the frontier. And echoing something Ergen just said, if we've just become a bit less grandiose and start realizing, hey, you know what, we might be able to catch up with Denmark or Holland in terms of prosperity. If we set those kind of ambitions rather than trying to be so world-beating or whatever we think it is, we might actually get better policy, and that would be better. So investments, it's a lot worse than you think. There are free ports and investment zones, but there are also enterprise zones, which George Osborne announced. There are tourism action zones. Did you know that? There's a tourism action zone probably quite near here. And there's even something, look it up, I'm not lying to you, there's something called the food enterprise zone, which you can go in there, and this is where they're particularly enterprising with their food. So, yeah, the
innovative jams.
Yeah, innovative jam. We don't sell quite enough varieties of jam. So, yeah, there's a lot of clearing up to do. I think it's a slightly ridiculous if you think that England could fit as a small stamp on the map of Texas, that we have zones within that small stamp, that actually if we had better transport and a more complete internal market, then we wouldn't be trying to parcel things up with so many internal borders. So I don't think it's great policy. It's very hard to undo because it's very sticky. People love it when they've got one. But I wouldn't, let's not add any more. That's why
Ben, what's your take on the various investment zones? And also, we spend a lot of time just thinking about, when we think about industry, people naturally think of manufacturing and high value, getting high up the supply chain. The UK is a small, very open, service-based economy. What is the future of that part of our industry, which includes financial services and every other types of services, the ones that we export to the rest of the world, in a future where industrial policy is a political priority?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, Mehreen. So I think I've got a very micro point on investment zones first, which is a really boring point, but I think it's worth stating, because this is a bit of a CPP win, is that we actually have pushed with our inclusive growth network for investment zones to take on a broader meaning of than just tax breaks. So essentially it's a way of providing areas with more capacity when they don't have much capacity. Having said that, this is not the way you design a system, right? So you do have all of those patchwork of different zones. You also, of course, have all the different funding pots and funding arrangements that local governments and regional governments have to put in. So I think a really quick win for the next government is actually to consolidate a lot of all of this mess and noise in line with the strategic objective, which is actually how do we improve the productivity of left behind areas, and how do we enable that to happen within a new devolution framework? And actually a lot of that could be solved by consolidation and better targeting of funding based on need. And so one of the ideas that we've had is, well, why don't we devolve, say, 2% of income tax? 1% of that is then redistributed to the poorest areas, and 1% places can use as they want as well. So it provides that additional fiscal flexibility while keeping with the tenet of redistribution. I think that's really a really important point. But I'm not sure that answers all of your points in your question.
We might have to come back to it. So we've got about 6 minutes, and we will take 5 minutes, I've been told. So we will take some questions. We'll group them together, keep them short. I think we'll take 3. So we have one gentleman here, and then the lady in the corner, and then one gentleman right at the back.
Hi, I'm the lecturer in politics from King's College London, and also personally American, living here, observing the political picture in both countries, especially in the UK, since I moved here from the very beginning of the Brexit. So much of the productivity speed up in the US is in retailing industry, but here is about manufacturing, financial services, oil and gas. There's a huge difference between two countries, as Claire mentioned. But the academic research has argued that after the pandemic, the future path of the industry productivity is going to change, and possibly into the retailing industry, just like US does. What's your thought? Thank you.
Thank you. And the lady in the corner?
Hello, my name's Alison Clark, and I'm down from Newcastle, where I work at Insights North East. I feel like we've heard a lot about social justice and the social side of sustainability and inclusivity today, but maybe not so much on the environmental side of things beyond net zero. So I'm talking about things like biodiversity and species decline, pollution and degradation of habitat. I wondered if we could just have a bit from the panel on that.
Thank you. And we'll take from the gentleman at the back, and I think there was also a lady here, so we'll very quickly take the lady as well, and then we'll have to wrap up. So one gentleman right at the back.
Thanks. Greg Rosen, Senior Counsel at SEC Newgate. The Brexiteers popularised immigration reform, talking about the benefits of an Australian points-based immigration system, and the idea of Australian system seemed to land well as a concept with voters. Planning reform, you talked about crucial for growth. To what extent can that planning reform be incremental within the existing English system? To what extent should the government think of importing a planning system from abroad that works better?
And just the lady at the end of the aisle here.
Sorry, which one?
Oh, just...
Could you put a hand up?
Yeah,
I've got it
there.
Hi.
And then we'll wrap up.
My name's Sarah Horner. I work for the Welsh Government. You haven't mentioned devolved government today. So any quick thoughts on that? Also, the role of the UK Internal Market Act, which is quite often used to overturn policy passed in those respective legislations, or the threat of it is used to inhibit growth in those countries.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we've got 4 questions, about less than a minute each. Who wants to have the UK versus US being completely different economies and requiring different approaches? I think, Claire, you kind of touched upon that, but is there anything else you want to add that we miss when we think about the US as a comparator?
I suppose the question was about retail and about future industries, and I suppose it goes to the point generally, which is what is the purpose of an industrial strategy, and we can argue what should and shouldn't go in it. In a sense, like my argument is more, it's exactly to that point, is to project forward, because labour and workforce is a huge part of the opportunity and the problem at the moment. So immigration's been touched on, but huge amounts of people are employed currently in retail, care, hospitality, etc. So I think the bit that we haven't really talked about as much is actually the workforce development side of it. So not specifically on retail, but on that wider point of we do not currently have the labour force we need. there is clearly a political ceiling on how much you can, whether you think it's the right thing, fulfil that through immigration. We absolutely have to build up the skills and education and modernisation of our education system. And therefore, I think we have to be thinking much more allied to industrial strategy is our workforce strategy of the future, because we have so many people who are whose our education should absolutely not be stopping at 18. This is not for me about bashing higher education or further education. It's the fact that the other side of the equation is the people that we've got to build the things that we've been talking about are not in our current pipeline, and therefore having a long-term approach to some of that kind of skills development, I think, is crucial. And just briefly on devolved governments, I did mention the devolved governments in relation to Labour's missions. They're absolutely geared to governments at all levels. They are not just geared to this is what the Labour Party are going to do. They are about what the country does together, and therefore what is the plan within each jurisdiction to deliver on that. So I think we actually have talked about devolution a fair amount, even if we haven't talked specifically about the government's policy on it.
There was a question about the environmental impact of industrial policy. We talk about the fact that we need to develop renewable industries, but has anyone thought about this question?
I'm happy to just try. I mean, this is a hugely important and strategic topic, and we don't have very long. And look, the way that I think I would design the industrial policy going forward is to make sure that any activity we support through state intervention has to be seen through the lens of the environment and net zero. It's never an add-on. And that was actually, I mean, I did welcome the $4.5 billion intervention we had last week, and then the manufacturing plan this week. But actually, one of the things wrong with it is exactly that. It was a list of announcements, and then at the end it was, and by the way, of this, 950 million, I think it is for various green acceleration industries. And the way I would do it is I would say, here is the activities, and all of them ultimately have to deliver for the environment and net zero. If they don't, they just don't make the list at all. And that is certainly how, again, other European countries have structured their industrial policy.
And then final one on planning. Does anyone do it very well? Giles, do you want to jump in?
I don't know who we can copy, but all I would say is the only thing they've had more of than industrial strategies are two things: housing ministers and wars on red tape. And the odd thing is they haven't done it about the right way, which is Greg highlights, I expect, that it's much, much too difficult to do things in this country. It seems that after about 14 years, the government has spotted we should look at the activities that are difficult to do, make them easier. In terms of planning infrastructure, the 4-year timescales that should be 2 or 1. And my final plea for continuity, therefore, they've called it something asinine like Get Great Britain Building Again. But there is a whole list of good ideas in there that I hope the next government just keeps going with.
Thank you very much. There's a big black zero staring at me, which means we have run out of time. So my final task is to thank the panel, and thanks for all the questions too. Thank you very much.
One more time, Mehreen Khan, Giles Wilkes, Jürgen Meyer, Ben Franklin, Claire Ainsley. Fantastic panel. Thank you very much.